Welcome to Unleash the Network podcast, a podcast that aims to inspire and educate our listeners by sharing stories of successful Mastercard Foundation scholars and African Leadership Academy alumni who have gone on to make a positive impact in their communities and promote the values of leadership, innovation, and entrepreneurship. Adnan, thank you for joining me, brother.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Renatus.
How have you been?
Things have been good. Busy as usual. Law school as usual. Reading a lot of reading. I don't think I've read this much in my life.
You took the road less traveled, and I'm talking about law. When you think about most of the ALA alumni, they'll probably go into entrepreneurship, into business, into arts, into politics, but you'll hardly hear students going into law. Why law for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think that when I first came to ALA, I was already interested in entrepreneurship. And I think that a lot of people think that possibly if you become a lawyer, you can't necessarily be an entrepreneur. But actually, I beg to differ. And I think if you look at the company that I'm working at, it's actually a startup. The chief legal officer, yeah, the one who hired me, he is also a director and he's an entrepreneur. And I think that that's how easily it is to fit someone in to a startup as a lawyer, is if you have enough experience and you have experience in instructing counsel and just other lawyers in terms of dealing with your company's legal needs, there's a very, very high possibility that you can be a successful entrepreneur and you'd be very, very useful as a chief legal officer. And I think that's actually what we probably should be doing or should be looking for, because a lot of entrepreneurs may just think that you can run your business on autopilot, but you need legal working knowledge at least, and you need a lawyer in-house. I'd argue every business out there, right, that's operating at a certain capacity where you're dealing with a lot of paperwork, you're dealing with a lot of people, and just in general, as far as it's possible to afford that, you should hire a legal officer or legal counsel. I think it's essential for any successful business.
And so, speaking about law and African entrepreneurs, why is it important for African entrepreneurs to have a working knowledge of the law, even if they're going to have in house advisors?
The law literally impacts every single aspect of your life without exaggeration. And for me, it's actually a mystery why we've always been told that math is mandatory in school, but law is not mandatory in school. Because I'll give you an example. You think that, for example, you're going to the mama mboga and you're buying vegetables, but that's not a contract. That's a legally binding contract. Yeah, it's an oral contract. People think that for you to have a contract, it has to be in writing. No, generally speaking, that's not the case. Yeah, people, for example, think that, okay, if I leave an offer in the UK, according to UK law, if I give you an offer, for example, and I say that, okay, Renatus, I'm going to offer you the opportunity to buy a certain book. Yeah, the offer is open until Tuesday. On Sunday, I close the offer. Under UK law, that's totally legal. It's totally fine. And you can't come and say, oh, but you came to me and you told me that you're going to keep the offer open till Wednesday. No, the reason why is because you didn't give me any consideration, like anything in exchange. So under UK, something as simple as that, right? It just governs the way you interact with people. And as a business person, the reason why I say it's good to have working legal knowledge is because obviously lawyers are expensive. Unfortunately, that's the case. So you can be able to cut your costs if you have basic working knowledge. So for example, just knowing that, okay, well, if I am going to, let's say, be appointing a director under UK law, then I have to pass this specific resolution within the company. Or if I want to raise finance, for example, just knowing, for example, that something called preemption rights, and we'll get into this later because I have an example about how it can destroy your business if you ignore the law, right? But something as basic as preemption rights, if you know that they exist, you're already miles ahead of other entrepreneurs who some of them may have even ended up in court because of issues like this. Yeah. And those, by then, the costs are insane. And you'll be in court for maybe even a decade just for you to lose maybe $1 million in the court case. all these different things, right? It's really important to have that working knowledge because even if you're not going to be a lawyer, you just know how to navigate roughly certain things. So if I was to recommend, for example, like essential areas of law, I would recommend every single entrepreneur to have working knowledge of things like commercial law, especially if you're selling goods. Yeah, these are things you need to know. For commercial law, there's a lot of um, implied terms where the government says that, okay, you need to, for example, these goods have to be of satisfactory quality, they have to meet a certain description, and you have to give good title to the person that you're selling those goods to. All of these things are essential. If you just know that, right, then you're already in a position where you know if someone is, for example, threatening to sue you, you know at least, okay, well, no, they actually don't really have a case, right? You don't have to be a genius to do that. And you don't have to be a lawyer to even just gauge whether or not someone has a valid claim. Yeah, but obviously where it gets very complicated, that's where you start hiring people to give you like proper legal advice, like proper lawyers. But apart from that, there's commercial law. Well, that's the first one I've mentioned. And anything that has to do with business law. So for example, employment law. Yeah. You could be hiring people, and then let's say you fire someone, yeah, and you don't give them their notice period. But at the same time, you haven't given them payment in lieu of notice, right? It's not the same in every country, obviously, but I'm just talking from a UK context, yeah. And there could be similar ideas in your local jurisdiction. So now imagine you're thinking, oh, I can just let this guy go, right? But let's say the monthly salary is like, let's say what, 15,000 shillings, just as an example. Just 15,000, just as an example, yeah? 15,000 shillings, right? You don't give them payment in lieu of notice, you would still have to give them the 15K. What if you have cash flow problems? If you understand what I'm saying, right? All these small things you need to know, employment law. Another essential one, especially for entrepreneurs that are looking to raise finance internationally, equity finance specifically, yeah, share issuances, etc. You have to have working knowledge of company law. If you're going to be a director, do not be a director. And I'm telling you this, do not be a director if you do not have working knowledge of how a company works. Things like what shareholders are, what their roles are, what directors are, what their roles are, what filings you have to do. For example, if there is a regime in place, that means you have to declare certain things to the government, or you have to have a company's register, updating the register, dealing with things like share issuances, dealing with people who are directors, because very, very simply put, and obviously we're going to get into horror stories, legal horror stories. You could honestly have stories, and I've heard these stories, yeah, where some people will literally get pushed out of their own business, right? And there's nothing you can do because you didn't adequately like the protection for your role as a director, you did not adequately protect yourself. And now this is your idea, you've put in money into this, you've put in time into this, you've put in your blood, sweat, and tears into this, and then people who have another opinion about the business, they push you out of the business. These things happen.
Yeah, they
Right?
do happen. They do happen.
Yeah. So
And I
that's just
think
some of the reasons. Yeah.
and I think also for our audience to understand, we are mostly covering the UK law because it applies to a lot of African countries.
Yeah, in terms of the similarities, in the sense that in the UK we follow what's common law, called common law. So common law is essentially it's derived from a couple of sources. So you have first of all statute, yeah, which is the laws that the government passes, etc. And then you have case law. So obviously in the UK you have what's called judge-made law, and you can have certain principles where the government doesn't need to write it into law. You just take it to court, and for example, you have certain principles. So like a lot of contract law, for example, is very case law specific. Like you'll have to look at the case and say that, okay, this is a Supreme Court judgment, it's binding on all the courts below it. So a lot of African countries, for example, South Africa has a similar system. Kenya has a very similar system, actually, and that's why I came to the UK, actually. But Kenya has a very, very similar system in the sense of you have that judge-made element of the law, albeit that the constitution is written, etc. But a lot of francophone countries, for example, will have what's called civil law. And for civil law, you have a code, yeah? And in that code, you have the law itself codified. And I'm not sure, again, if it applies wholesale. It's obviously going to be different in different jurisdictions, but you're going to have different courts may have opinions, but they might not be as binding. So it's important to just know these different things. So, for example, the reason why I say it's, again, important to understand law is like basic things like may apply in certain jurisdictions that don't in others. So, for example, in a lot of civil law jurisdictions, there is a duty to negotiate in good faith. So that means that you have to disclose certain things. For example, let's say it's an acquisition of a company. You might have to actually disclose certain facts about the company that would be reasonably required by the other party you're negotiating with to have an informed decision about whether they want to buy your company or not, right? So this is very important, right? But in the UK, there's nothing like that. And there's another principle that applies that's called caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. So essentially, you're saying to them, you have to spend a lot of money doing due diligence on this company. It's up to you to find what the problems are with my company before you buy it, right? And it's up to you to satisfy yourself, right? So again, we'll get into this because when it comes to, I mean, maybe I'll speak a bit more about specific things that people should focus on and be aware of. And that's when I'll probably make my case and just give a few examples about how these things actually come into play for African entrepreneurs specifically.
Well, seems like we have like 7 more minutes, so let's jump straight into them.
That's wow, that's very, very short, but we'll see what we can do in that amount of time. But yeah, I think what I'll do is I'll just very briefly go through some examples, and this is possibly my case, whether it's to ALA or to anyone else, to just develop your legal knowledge. But also for ALA students, I'll give a very brief introduction to how you can become an international lawyer. Like maybe I'll even just do 2 minutes on that, and then the others I'll just speak about these examples. So okay, the reason why I think, for example, it's very good to have working knowledge of certain things, or at least to have legal advisors in your company, right? Especially from an ALA perspective, I think that there should be a lot more effort made in terms of connecting young African leaders with law firms that are international law firms who would love to take ALA kids. Like I know this from just seeing the people that have gone to these law firms that come from African backgrounds, and they themselves are leaders, and I could see themselves at ALA, right? But I think that the ALA should really push this for a couple of reasons. Like, for example, SVB. For those who don't know about SVB, it was essentially a bank in Silicon Valley. It's called Silicon Valley Bank. And they were holding deposits of a lot of startups, right? Many, many startups, a lot of tech startups. And essentially because of higher interest rates and also just the fact that they did not necessarily manage their portfolio or the assets in a certain way, that means that they had liquidity issues and they couldn't exactly meet the deposits because people were withdrawing deposits from SVB. I won't get into that story because it's a very complex, long thing. But the point is this: you had some African startups, and I believe it was from Nigeria actually, that were possibly put in danger. And I don't know the specifics, but I heard something of the sort. And if not, again, it's just an idea. If you have any money in a bank like that, what happens when a bank fails? Especially in this economic environment, it's good to understand as an entrepreneur. Yeah. People had money in SVB, but a lot of entrepreneurs possibly didn't know that when a bank fails in the US, in some states, right, they will only guarantee your deposits until $250,000. So now let's say, wow, you've gotten people writing stories about your business, maybe you've even made to Y Combinator, right? You're doing amazing things and you have $2 million sitting in SVB, right? And you're using that money for working capital purposes to pay your employees, to ensure that people's pensions are being contributed to, etc. And then SVB fails. If they were not to be bailed out, right, like they have been, you would essentially have access to 250,000 out of that 2 million. And that's after maybe a week. And obviously, it's very possible, and some people don't know this, under UK law especially, it's very possible. Let's say you have a UK subsidiary, because I mean, I'm talking from a UK law perspective. Let's say you have that subsidiary. If that subsidiary is struggling to pay its debt as they fall due, someone can go to court and they can apply to dissolve your company. And that's the end of your company, in the UK, at least, anyways. In some other states, it's probably even more strict. In some, it's more possibly lenient. But the fact of the matter is this: cash flow issues can result from things like that. And if you don't have a legal advisor, you're setting yourself up for failure, because these things can be managed. So, for example, you can hedge your risk by, some people put their money into money markets. Other people have just decided to have a more asset heavy asset sort of portfolio where they're putting their money, or some are just investing in more liquid assets, etc. Some are not necessarily just using bank accounts. They'll use a range of different bank accounts, and maybe they'll say that, okay, we're only going to put, as a company policy, maybe above, in the UK, £15,000 above the deposit protection limit, right? Because in the UK, it's like £85,000. That's £85,000, right? Imagine having 20 million in a bank account and then you only get access to 85, you'll be finished, right? So the point is, situations like that, that's where you can see that it's important to have legal advisors. A second one, right, just very, very quickly, because I know we don't have as much time, is something called preemption rights. So a lot of people are raising finance. I know a lot of ALA alumni are probably raising finance by issuing shares. Yeah. So now, for example, let's say me and you, we started a business. And again, I'm going to use UK law as an example, but the concept of preemption rights applies in other countries. It may not apply the same way, but it's very possible that it can have very similar outcomes, right? So let's say me and you, we start a company. We're both shareholders. Yeah. And then we decide to issue shares, but you forget to waive your preemption rights. What are preemption rights? Preemption rights are when you issue shares, essentially all of the other shareholders have a right to be offered those shares first before anyone else. That's what preemption rights are. And they can disapply those preemption rights, or they can waive them, or they can just reject the offer, or some can even exercise, because you don't want a rogue shareholder coming from outside. So now, under UK law, for example, right, which may govern some shareholders' agreements, by the way, for international companies, right? Let's say you didn't disapply them, and then your company goes to the moon. Literally, you guys have gone IPO, right? So now, me and you, we fall out, and you want to leave the company, but you realize, oh, we forgot to disapply preemption rights. And let's say I was supposed to offer you maybe like 50,000 shares. Yeah, you can sue me and say, because Adnan didn't offer me those 50,000 shares, I've suffered damage, because today those shares are worth $5 million, right? And now I've experienced loss because of that. And now I, as a shareholder, could be, or like just the company as a whole, could be liable to you for $5 million. Just think about that, right? Small things like this can make a difference between, or like they can make a huge difference in terms of businesses, whether someone would even want to acquire you or not. These are very, very big things, right? That people should perhaps think about when they think that, oh, we don't necessarily need legal advice, right? That's just more or less my general scoping of, like, for example, why it's important that as part of entrepreneurship, fine, we can do business model canvas, we can do this and that, we can do risk management, we can do board meetings, we can do this and that. There has to be an element that deals with the law. And that's probably where I'll just wrap up in terms of this specific part. But if you want to ask anything else before I get into how to become an international lawyer, then go ahead.
I'm just gonna have to ask you to help us understand the process of becoming an international lawyer.
Obviously, the first thing is obviously get an LLB. An LLB or a Juris Doctor, depending on your jurisdiction, yeah? And I'm talking about common law. I'm going to speak about common law, right? So mainly UK, US law, Australian law, Kenyan law, etc. For common law jurisdictions, have an LLB from a common law jurisdiction, yeah? And I would advise people to get it from using a legal system that's internationally used. So people don't realize this, but English and Welsh law, when I got here, I just thought, okay, it's only applying in England. But people don't understand that for international agreements, you can actually choose, in most cases, which law you want to govern the contract. So to give you an example of how influential English and Welsh law is, there's a statistic that these shipping contracts called BIMCO contracts, yeah, these are used for massive commodities sales of like beans, hay, all these different things, right? Around 80% of those, I think, are governed by that specific contract. Yeah, the shipping contracts are governed by BIMCO, and BIMCO uses English and Welsh law. So now, as an African who's, let's say, wanting an entrepreneur from ALA, let's say you want to start a shipping business, yeah? Or let's say you're a lawyer, you want to specialize in shipping law and you've come from ALA, right? It would be a huge advantage if you had an English and Welsh law qualification. Because, for example, I don't need to work in the UK. I can go to the US, I can go to Europe, I can go to Malaysia if I wanted to. I can go to Australia because now you can cross-qualify without needing to take an extra exam in Australia. This is something I've heard. You have to confirm if that's correct though, because I haven't really checked myself, but I've heard it's a thing. I can go to Dubai, for example, and work on investments, specifically to East Africa. It's a very popular thing that's happening right now. A lot of investments coming from the Middle East to East Africa, right? So I'd say the UK is probably the ideal jurisdiction to qualify in, right? And it's where a lot of people come from. People from Malaysia, Hong Kong, they all come to the UK and study a qualification. So if you're in the US, let's say you're thinking about this, I would actually advise you to do this first. You should apply for a training contract with a law firm. If you're really passionate about it, you're like 100%, I want to be a lawyer. You need to apply to a training contract. I mean, just apply for a training contract at an international law firm that has offices in the UK. Why do I say this? If you're concerned about access to finance, and let's say you're on a scholarship in the US, they are willing to possibly pay for you to be able to study and to give you a grant of maintenance so that you can also obviously like have a roof over your head and stuff when you're studying. And then obviously they're willing to pay you throughout the training contract. And usually the salary is like, if you're going to join a US firm, it's obviously quite, I can't lie, they actually pay quite well in terms of like the starting salary when you qualify in the UK for a lot of US firms is around £180,000 a year, 160 to £180,000 a year. Some even £200,000, but obviously the working hours are like deadly. But but yeah, basically things like that. So that's something you could do. You could have a career, and then you can specialize in an Africa practice if that's what you want, right? So that's what I'd advise people to do. But in terms of how now you become an international lawyer, now this is the most difficult part. Yeah. It's if you really want to cross-qualify, I highly suggest that you do. So for example, I'm considering, obviously, if I can be qualified in Kenya, the UK, and the US, that's my ideal thing. If I could do that, then I'm able to do all kinds of work everywhere, right? But specifically for us, the reason why I'm saying like you can still do work in the African continent without even being qualified in an African jurisdiction is because there's a lot of international agreements, even between African countries, yeah, where the governing law is a law of a specific country, like English and Welsh law or French law, etc. So it's a matter of, obviously, this is a symptom of colonialism, so it's not exactly a great thing. But at the same time, if we're talking about building our nations, we're talking about giving people economic freedom, we're talking about encouraging entrepreneurship, I would highly recommend it. Like if you want to look at someone, for example, let's say there's some people still wondering, like, how would I be able to do it? If you look at a man named Daniel Mutisia, yeah, he's a perfect example of someone who's doing work for the African continent, and he has a UK qualification and also a Kenyan qualification. And I'm going to wrap up very soon, yeah. But essentially, he works for a firm called Clifford Chance, and they have a lot of projects in Africa. Essentially, they've advised governments, and a lot of their partner firms are African firms like Bowman's. Another example, a firm called DLA Piper. They have 20 offices in Africa. As a lawyer, you can argue for a secondment opportunity to an African office if you want to. It's very, very possible, right? But even just to give you an example of deals that people have worked on, there's a company called Freshfields, Brookhouse Derringer, and they are one of the most revered law firms as well. It's in the UK, it's in Europe, etc. They actually advised the Kenyan government on a specific highway, building that highway, advising on issues of finance related, etc. All of these different things. I know a partner at a firm, again, DLA Piper. They helped build one of the first wind farms that's like a specific type of wind farm in Morocco, and they helped finance that. So the opportunities are endless. And I encourage people to do a bit more research and perhaps to look at what you think is the best for you. But I would definitely argue that if you can get dual qualified, then you're going to be able to do so much for the continent, or at least qualify in a jurisdiction where you know that the work that you can be doing is cross-border. That's what I would highly recommend for ALA students specifically, right? But that's more or less a very short, very crunched guide on how you can be an international lawyer.
Ignorance of the law is no excuse.
It's most definitely not a defense.
Thank you so much, Adnan.